Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today is June the 13th, 2026. Um, I think I'm gonna dub June the month of expose, uh, since I did an earlier video, a couple of videos about some fraudsters that were exposed in June. Of course, we're still bemused by the exposure of the CIA senior official David Rush, who turned out not only who happened to have not only stolen about over $40 million worth of gold bars and $2 million in cash from the CIA, according to the criminal complaint affidavit filed against him in the U.S. District Court of Eastern District of Virginia by FBI Special Agent Matthew Johnson. But also, it turns out that he fabricated his entire resume. Um, you know, but I've done videos discussing David Rush, and I want to talk about some other uh, fraudsters who gained notoriety and fame, having fabricated being Holocaust victims. I did earlier videos, and Joseph Hertz. I talked about Joseph Hertz, who had faked being an Auschwitz survivor. Of course, he was exposed as well in June 2016. That's a decade ago. So that was the month of June. And also, I did a video about Maria Sophie Hingst, who was a historian, had a PhD in history, and she was exposed June uh, in June of 2019 by the uh, German paper Der Spiegel, and unfortunately, she took her own life the following month. Now, interestingly, Der Spiegel had also exposed this person I want to talk about. She went by Misha Misha Di Fonseca. So Der Spiegel had first indicated in an article that her story sounded too good to be true, and raised skepticism regarding her story. So let me get into the story of Misha Di Fonseca. Misha Di Fonseca would publish a book that turned out to be a bestseller in Europe. It was translated into 18 languages. There was actually a movie done of her story in France, and Oprah promoted her and invited her, to be on her show. But for some reason, Misha Di Fonseca had been combative, and that fell through. Uh, the name of her book was titled. It's still out there, by the way. It's still in circulation. You can find it. I found it on Amazon. It's Misha Memoir uh, of the Holocaust years. Right. Again, it turned out to be an entire fabrication. Now, it describes how she uh, she set off, at a very young age in her pubescent years, when she was ostensibly, maybe 10, but, in her prepubescent years. And she set off looking for her parents, her Jewish parents, who had been deported by the Nazis into the concentration camps. So she trekked for about 1,900 miles from Belgium, where she was supposed to have been born, and she, walked through Poland, Ukraine, you know, and Italy for a total of 1900 miles. At some point, she was adopted by a pack of wolves, so she became a feral child. She got into the Warsaw ghetto, of course, in Poland, and at some point she escaped, killing a Nazi soldier who tried to rape her. And she got back to Belgium. This story was published by uh, her publisher, who had been a small time publisher in Massachusetts, because Misha de Fonseca would later emigrate to America with her husband Maurice de Fonseca, who had been a CEO of Honeywell in Europe. Her story is very unclear, but in any event, the publisher was Jane Daniel, right? She was a small-time publisher in in Massachusetts, and heard her story because Misha de Fonseca had started to narrate her tales around Massachusetts in synagogues around Massachusetts of her, Holocaust survival, and so Jane Daniel, who was who owned, it's called Mount Ivy, publishers. It was a small publication, uh, you know publishing company, and so she decided to publish her story. She believed it would be a bestseller, and it turned out to be a bestseller. However, it became successful, and of course, money is the root of all sorts of evil. Money would turn out to divide them. The ghostwriter who was co-author was a friend of Jane Daniel. Her name was Vera Lee. She and Michel de Fonseca, became dissatisfied with the fee arrangements and sued Jane Daniel, for breach of contract. And so they both won a total of about over $30 million, with Verily being awarded $11 million, and uh, Misha de Fonseca getting the bulk, winning $22.5 million. So you see, this was a lot of money for from the publication. Of course, Jane Daniel, the publisher, who had put so much and was wholly, in part, I mean, she felt responsible for the success of the book, and although she had doubted, she had some suspicions about the book, but she was a business person, and she went ahead and published it anyway. She became her own detective, and she felt humiliated. She'd been ruined by the lawsuits, and so she started to dig herself. She started to uh, play detective and research, what she should have done before. But of course, the profits that were to be made from this fantastic book by Misha de Fonseca, of course, over got the better of her. It turned out that Misha de Fonseca was not her real name. Uh, Jane Daniel would come across, would get her old name, her real name. It turned out the real name of Misha de Fonseca was actually Monique Deval. She was born Monique Deval in Belgium, and she was born in 1937 and not 1934 as she claimed. She started to do her research, and she uncovered that the period 1943, Monique Deval was actually enrolled in an elementary school in Belgium. At that, the part of when, a time in which Misha de Fonseca, right, which turned out to be just a pseudonym or a nom de plume, or, it was an alias, not her real name. At that time, she claimed to be living as a feral child, being raised by a pack of wolves, and going through her trek across Europe. It turned out she never left Belgium, but she was actually in elementary school at that time, and she was born in 1937, as I said. So eventually, though, in 2000, was it in February 2008? About 11 years after the publication, the book was first published in 1997. Uh, Misha de Fonseca would admit, and a Belgian newspaper, Le Soir would carry her confession. She admitted that the her story was entire work of fiction. She was taken to court, and by the publisher, her publisher, Jane Daniel, and who would win uh, a suit against her. So she was ordered to that's Misha de Fonseca was ordered to return the entire, $22.5 million to pay her publisher. That's uh, the disgraced Jane Daniel, $22.5 million. However, under oath, um, De Fonseca engaged in her own revisionist victim cosplay, right? Retroactive victim cosplay, and said it was difficult for her to separate reality, from her own reality, and that at the time of the publication, her defense was at the time of the publication, she believed her fabrication to be true. It turned out that um, Misha de Fonseca, whose real name was Monique Deval, had a true sad story, and her parents were actually murdered, were killed by Nazis, uh, in a concentration camp, well, or called St. Gilles prison, right? They had been arrested and tortured. So it turns out her parents were not Jewish. So she was not Jewish as she claimed. Her parents were actually Roman Catholics, and they were members of the Belgian resistance. They were arrested by Nazis when she was 4 years old, in 1941, and they were taken and imprisoned at St. Gilles prison, and they were tortured. Under torture, her father would reveal the names of other resistance members, and so they were killed, by Nazis, and the orphan, Monique Duval, was now taken and adopted by her uncle and her grandfather. Uh, the family that took her relatives who took her in, did not treat her well, and apparently it was around this time that she started to create fantasies about walking through Europe, right? Walking through Europe on her own to look for her parents in Nazi concentration camps. So it's ironic that even though her story was very fantastic, it just sounded too good to be true. This child, a prepubescent child who wanders off on her own, trekking, living on offals and on insects, and then being raised as a feral child by a pack of wolves. By the way, many researchers and scientists agree that it's unlikely for wolves to raise an infant, a child. However, there have been stories, there are true stories, rare stories of children having been raised by wolves, and I'm not talking about the founders of Rome, the brothers Remus and Romulus. Of course, the myth of the creation of Rome is that those two brothers were suckled by wolves. There's actually a story of an Indian child, and of course a Spanish boy who was spent many years as a feral child raised by wolves. And I'll probably do a video. I don't want to digress, and I'll talk about those instances that are rare, that have actually occurred. But those children have developmental disabilities. They're not able to talk, and they walk on all fours. and uh, you know, Misha de Fonseca or Monique Duval, whatever you want to call her, did not show any of these signs that she'd been a feral child. In any event, uh, she was exposed as a fraud, and there's a movie of it. There's a movie of her called Misha and the Wolves. A documentary. I think it was released in 2021, just talking about how she made up this story, this fabrication about the Holocaust, about being Jewish, and how people ate it all up. What causes people to not question Holocaust survivors' stories, because many people took advantage of the Holocaust and fabricated um, survivor stories, even though they were not even those that were not Jewish. By the way, as a disclaimer, I was a Holocaust study fellow in 2020 at the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, Columbia University, and I studied Holocaust literature. The Holocaust, was a true event in which 6 million Jews were exterminated in Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War. Unfortunately, stories like fabrications like those of Misha de Fonseca, whose true name, of course, turned out to be Monique Duval, and who was Roman Catholic and not Jewish. They tend to add grist for the mill for Holocaust deniers and revisionists. So, um, you know, while we do expose fraudsters like Misha de Fonseca, it's important to also, um, you know, remind, memorialize the facts of the Holocaust. In fact, there's a bit of revisionism that's going on in America today as well. And it is sad that it's happening amongst African Americans. Some people are denying that the transatlantic slave trade ever happened or was the source of blacks being transplanted from Africa to the United States, right? They're black Americans that are spreading disinformation, falsehoods, and engaging in revisionism by claiming that black Americans are indigenous to the land, right? That black Americans were the first people found in America and there was no transatlantic slave. They didn't come through the transatlantic slave. So it's horrible. I don't know what the motivation. I'm not a psychologist, so I won't delve into the motivation for such revisionism. For instance, Misha de Fonseca, she claimed that given the tragedy of her parents' death and torture, under the Nazis, creation of the fantastic story of her being Jewish and trekking through Europe, being raised by a pack of wolves, when she claims she was being abused by her relatives who had adopted her. It was her own coping mechanism, and along the way, she claimed that she was able to differentiate reality, facts, reality from her own reality, that she'd created as a defensive, protective mechanism. In any event, the book is out there, and there's a documentary on her story, Misha de Fonseca. I want to keep this video short, and I'll do other videos that have exposed frauds, and it's kind of funny. Many of them have come in the month of June. Misha de Fonseca, however, her fraud was exposed in February 2008, right? We can also say 2008, I suppose. My name's Olurotimi Osha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.